Good morning. It is August 16th, a Monday of 2021, and we're here to read about 10 minutes a day from the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. And we're going to continue reading toward the end of the book in chapter 21 from John Hasnas, The Myth of the Rule of Law from 1995. And we're starting on page 328, and this is section 8. So let me pull out the bookmark, and we'll get to reading. On page 328 at the top. I've been arguing that the law is inherently indeterminate, and further, that this may not be such a bad thing. I realize, however, that you may still not be convinced. Even if you are now willing to admit that the law is somewhat indeterminate, you probably believe that I have vastly exaggerated the degree to which this is true. After all, it is obvious that the law cannot be radically indeterminate. If this were the case, the law would be completely unpredictable. Judges hearing similar cases would render wildly divergent decisions. There would be no stability or uniformity in the law. But as important as the current legal system may be, this is clearly not the case. The observation that the legal system is highly stable is, of course, correct. But it is a mistake to believe that this is because the law is determinate. The stability of the law derives not from any feature of the law itself, but from the overwhelming uniformity of ideological background among those empowered to make legal decisions. Consider who the judges are in this country. Typically, they are people from a solid middle to upper class background who performed well at an appropriately prestigious undergraduate institution, demonstrated the ability to engage in the type of analytical reasoning that is measured by the standardized law school admission test, the LSAT. Gosh, I remember taking that years ago. God, it was like 1995 or 6. Did it cold, just walked in and freaking took it, and did as I predicted, which was well enough to get into the law schools that my bachelor's degree would have allowed me to anyway. So I amortized, or I arbitraged the taking. All right, this is just such a huge diversion. Let's get back to it. Passed through the crucible of law school, complete with its methodological and political indoctrination, and went on to high-profile careers as attorneys, probably with a prestigious Wall Street-style law firm. To have been appointed to the bench, it is virtually certain that they were both politically moderate and well-connected, and, until recently, white males of the correct ethnic and religious pedigree. It should be clear that, culturally speaking, such a group will tend to be quite homogeneous, sharing a great many moral, spiritual, and political beliefs and values. Given this, it can hardly be surprising that there will be a high degree of agreement among judges as to how cases ought to be decided. But this agreement is due to the common set of normative presuppositions the judges share, not some immanent objective meaning that exists within the rules of law. In fact, however, the law is not truly stable, since it is continually, if slowly, evolving in response to changing social mores and conditions. This evolution occurs because each new generation of judges brings with it its own set of progressive normative assumptions. As the older generation passes from the scene, these assumptions come to be shared by an ever-increasing percentage of the judiciary. Eventually, they become the consensus of opinion among judicial decision-makers, and the law changes to reflect them. Thus, a generation of judges that regarded, quote, separate but equal as a perfectly legitimate interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment gave way to one which interpreted that clause as prohibiting virtually all governmental actions that classify individuals by race, which in turn gave way to one which interpreted the same language to permit benign racial classifications designed to advance the social status of minority groups. In this way, as the Moral and political values conventionally accepted by society change over time, so too do those embedded in the law. The law appears to be stable because of the slowness with which it evolves, but the slow pace of legal development is not due to any inherent characteristic of the law itself. Logically speaking, any conclusion, however radical, is derivable from the rules of law. It is simply that, even between generations, the range of ideological opinion represented on the bench is so narrow that anything more than incremental departures from conventional wisdom and morality will not be respected within the profession. Such decisions are virtually certain to be overturned on appeal, and thus are rarely even rendered in the first instance. Confirming evidence for this thesis can be found in our contemporary judicial history. Over the past quarter century, the, quote, diversity movement has produced a bar and concomitantly a bench somewhat more open to people of different racial, sexual, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. To some extent, this movement has produced a judiciary system that represents a broader range of ideological viewpoints than has been the case in the past. Over the same time period, we have seen an accelerated rate of legal change. Today, long-standing precedents are more freely overruled. Novel theories of liability are more frequently accepted by the courts, and different courts hand down different and seemingly irreconcilable decisions more often. In addition, it is worth noting that recently, the chief complaint about the legal system seems to concern the degree to which it has become, quote, politicized. This suggests that as the ideological solidarity of the judiciary breaks down, so too does the predictability of legal decision-making, and hence the stability of the law. Regardless of this trend, I hope it is now apparent that to assume that the law is stable because it is determinate is to reverse cause and effect. Rather, it is because the law is basically stable that it appears to be determinate. It is not the rule of law that gives us a stable legal system. It is the stability of the culturally shared values of the judiciary that gives rise to and supports the myth of the rule of law. And we'll go ahead and just get started in the next section of this essay, Section 9. It is worth noting that there is nothing new or startling about the claim that the law is indeterminate. This has been the hallmark of the critical legal studies movement since the mid-70s. The, quote, crits, however, were merely reviving the earlier contention of the legal realists, who made the same point in the 20s and 30s, and the realists were themselves merely repeating the claim of earlier jurisprudential thinkers. For example, as early as 1897, Oliver Wendell Holmes had pointed out, quote, the language of judicial decision is mainly the language of logic, and the logical method and form flatter that longing for certainty and for repose which is in every human mind. But certainty generally is illusion, and repose is not the destiny of man. Behind the logical form lies a judgment as to the relative worth and importance of competing legislative grounds. Often an inarticulate and unconscious judgment, it is true, and yet the very root and nerve of the whole proceeding. You can give any conclusion a logical form. End quote. This raises an interesting question. If it has been known for 100 years that the law does not consist of a body of determinate rules, why is the belief that it does still so widespread? If 4 generations of jurisprudential scholars have shown that the rule of law is a myth, why does the concept still command such fervent commitment? The answer is implicit in the question itself. For the question recognizes that the rule of law is a myth, and like all myths, it is designed to serve an emotive rather than cognitive function. The purpose of a myth is not to persuade one's reason, but to enlist one's emotions in support of an idea. And this is precisely the case for the myth of the rule of law. Its purpose is to enlist the emotions of the public in support of society's political power structure. People are more willing to support the exercise of authority over themselves when they believe it is to be an objective, neutral feature of the natural world. This was the idea behind the concept of the divine right of kings. By making the king appear to be an integral part of God's plan for the world, rather than an ordinary human being dominating his fellows by brute force, the public could be more easily persuaded to bow to his authority. However, when the doctrine of divine right became discredited, a replacement was needed to ensure that the public did not view political authority as merely the exercise of naked power. That replacement is the concept of the rule of law. People who believe they live under, quote, a government of laws and not people, tend to view their nation's legal system as objective and impartial. They tend to see the rules under which they must live not as expressions of human will, but as embodiments of neutral principles of justice, i.e., as natural features of the social world. Once they believe that they are being commanded by an impersonal law, rather than other human beings, they view their obedience to political authority as a public-spirited acceptance of the requirements of social life, rather than mere acquiescence to superior power. In this way, the concept of the rule of law functions much like the use of the passive voice by the politician who describes a delict on his or her own. Okay, I don't know that word. In this way, the concept of the rule of law functions much like the use of the passive voice by the politician who describes a delict on his or her part with the assertion, quote, mistakes were made. It allows people to hide the agency of power behind a facade of words, to believe that it is the law which compels their compliance, not self-aggrandizing politicians or highly capitalized special interests or wealthy white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males or blank, fill in your favorite culprit. But the myth of the rule of law does more than render the people submissive to state authority. It also turns them into the state's accomplices in the exercise of its power. For people who would ordinarily consider it a great evil to deprive individuals of their rights or oppress politically powerless minority groups, will respond with patriotic fervor when these same actions are described as upholding the rule of law. Consider the situation in India toward the end of British colonial rule. At that time, the followers of Mohandas Gandhi engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience by manufacturing salt for their own use in contravention of the British monopoly on such manufacture. The British administration and army responded with mass imprisonments and shocking brutality. It is difficult to understand this behavior on the part of the highly moralistic, ever so civilized British, unless one keeps in mind that they were able to view their activities not as violently repressing the indigenous population, but as upholding the rule of law. The same is true of the violence directed against the nonviolent civil rights protesters in the American South during the civil rights movement. Although much of the white population of the southern states held racist beliefs, one cannot account for the overwhelming support given to the violent repression of these protests on the assumption that the vast majority of the white Southerners were sadistic racists devoid of moral sensibilities. The true explanation is that most of these people were able to view themselves not as perpetuating racial oppression and injustice, but as upholding the rule of law against criminals and outside agitators. Similarly, since despite the 60s rhetoric, all police officers are not fascist pigs, some other explanation is needed for their willingness to participate in the, quote, police riot at the 1968 Democratic Convention, or the campaign of illegal arrests and civil rights violations against those demonstrating in Washington against President Nixon's policies in Vietnam, or the effort to infiltrate and destroy the sanctuary movement that sheltered refugees from Salvadorian death squads during the Reagan era, or, for that matter, the attack on and destruction of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco. It is only when these officers have fully bought into the myth that, quote, we are a government of laws and not people, end quote, when they truly believe that their actions are commanded by some impersonal body of just rules, that they can fail to see that they are the agency used by those in power to oppress others. The reason why the myth of the rule of law has survived for 100 years, despite the knowledge of its falsity, is that it is too valuable a tool to relinquish. The myth of impersonal government is simply the most effective means of social control available to the state. And we'll wrap up a rather long reading today. Toward the bottom of page 332, again, reading from the Anarchist Handbook, organized by that guy. Where is it? Can you read it? I don't know. Malice. That one. That Malice guy wrote this book. You should probably get yourself a copy. Probably won't be a hand leather-bound copy like mine, but you should get one and preserve it nonetheless. Some good ideas in here, and they're pretty dangerous, so they might be going away soon. Bye-bye.